What is it like to be a xenomorph drone? Well, it has to suck, except they seem like they really like it. But let's get into the details of what life is really like for a xenomorph drone. So first of all, you have no name, no sense of individuality whatsoever, no self in the human sense. You exist purely as an extension of the hive and at the queen's will. In psychological terms, this is the fusion of instinct and programming. Everything that is thought by your brain is filtered through the question, does this help the hive survive? The lack of ego is, I'm assuming, both liberating but also very terrifying. You have no guilt, no hesitation, no who am I existential crisis. But obedience and efficiency are what you got in spades, right? And it's a sensory world. It's very different. To the drone, the world is filtered through hyper sharp senses. Smell, vibrations, pheromone. This is how it perceives the reality. Where human sees wall, a drone sees a structural weakness. Where humans hear silence, the drone hears the thrum of a heartbeat. And it's the inner life of alien minimalism. No clutter with words, just raw impressions of prey, threats, and orders. And in terms of emotion, it's really hard to even say that what it has are emotions. It experiences drives, hunger, territorial aggression, protection of the queen. The closest thing to joy might be it feeling like it's feeling a victim's fear, or it kills something to protect the hive. Something that made the hive better is its closest thing to, true joy. And maybe grief would be the silence of a dead queen. But even that, it doesn't wallow in that. It moves on to the next command. Who is the next queen that's stepping up, right? And the hive mind, it doesn't have any alone time in its own head. It shares a psychic tether to the queen, and by extension, to the entire brood. And that means constant contact, no solitude. Imagine never being able to shut off your notifications, but the messages are all pheromones and commands that literally override your free will. Doesn't matter what you want to do. The drone's inner monologue is always drowned out by the hive's collective hum. So from a human standpoint, this is a terrible existence. No freedom, no personality, just weaponized instinct. But from the drone's perspective, this is clean. There's no doubt, there's no second guessing. The human brain is messy, and the drone's brain is highly efficient. Its nightmare would actually become an individual, to be cut off from the hive and forced to think for itself. That would be true madness for the drone. So I'm going to assume and overall that despite living in this constant hunt or build loop, feeling no guilt, no fear, no compulsion, experiencing the queen's will as your own voice, and being the perfect soldier, I'm going to assume it has a lot of joy in that because they seem pretty happy handling their business. But give me your thoughts on what it's like to be a xenomorph drone in the comment section, or let's talk about other creatures you want to do a deeper dive into.